The sirens were coming fast, slicing through the dark the way they always had, close enough that I felt that familiar tightening in my chest. Then something went wrong. The sound slowed, hesitated, shifted, like the noise itself had hit an invisible wall. My phone was already in my hand, the scanner app crackling to life with overlapping voices. Calm at first, then confusion, then urgency. Unit holding. Access blocked. Confirm alternate route. The dispatcher's tone changed mid-sentence, and that was the part that scared me most. You can hear it when time starts to matter. Red and blue lights flashed at the entrance of our community, trapped behind a brand new metal gate that hadn't been there yesterday. A heavy chain, a cheap padlock, HOA signs zip, tied like warnings instead of explanations. I ran toward it without thinking, my heart pounding hard enough to hurt. A contracted guard stepped in front of me and shook his head. He said it was a temporary closure. He said it was approved. He said it was about budget protocol. He said it the way people do when they've repeated a line enough times to stop hearing what it means. Somewhere behind me, someone was waiting for help that couldn't get through. Every second stretched thin and sharp. And standing there, listening to dispatch reroute emergency vehicles like this was normal, I realized this wasn't a mistake. Someone had chosen this. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update and tell me in the comments, where are you watching from? Before all of this, the neighborhood felt safe in a quiet, dependable way. Not flashy, not perfect, just reliable. We sat tucked between low hills and tree lines, far enough from the highway to feel peaceful, but never cut off from it. There was one clear access road in and out of the community, a wide, gently curving stretch that connected straight to the main road. Everyone knew it. Fire trucks knew it. Ambulances knew it. Police cruisers didn't hesitate when they turned onto it. For decades, that road was the difference between isolation and safety. I'd lived here long enough to see it work exactly as intended. Years back, there was a house fire 3 streets over that could have taken half the block if the engine hadn't arrived when it did. Another time, during a brutal heat wave, an elderly neighbor collapsed in his driveway and was in an ambulance within minutes. Even in winter, when side roads iced over and became a gamble, that access road stayed clear. It wasn't just pavement. It was the unspoken promise that help could always reach us. I didn't move here looking for conflict. I'd actually chosen this place because it felt settled, predictable. After years of work that trained me to expect problems before they surfaced, I wanted something quieter. Earlier in my life, I'd worked as a paralegal. Nothing dramatic, just contracts, timelines, and liability files. My job had been spotting small oversights before they turned into disasters. I left that field behind, but habits like that don't disappear. You learn to notice what isn't written down, what isn't documented, what people assume no one will question. At first, the HOA was easy to ignore. Routine notices, lawn reminders, trash bins placed too early, the usual low-level irritations people joke about. Then the leadership changed, and the tone shifted with it. Meetings stopped being about maintenance and started revolving around numbers. Every discussion came back to budgets, liability exposure, and cost efficiency. The board leader ran those meetings like a presentation, calm and polished, always steering conversations back to spreadsheets. Whenever someone raised a concern that didn't fit neatly into his charts, he'd straighten his tie and say the same thing every time. Let's stay focused on the numbers. Snow removal was the first red flag. The access road, we were told, cost too much to plow, too much salt, too many labor hours. Then came resurfacing expenses, then insurance. One board member joked that emergency vehicles were hard on pavement, like that was a problem instead of a purpose. People laughed nervously. I didn't. At one meeting, someone asked if reducing maintenance could affect response times. The board leader adjusted his tie, smiled, and said, "Let's stay focused on the numbers." He said emergency situations were rare. He said alternate routes existed. He said modern responders were trained to adapt. The room nodded along, relieved to have an answer that sounded confident, even if it wasn't specific. The comments grew more casual after that. Complaints about unnecessary traffic. Suggestions about limiting access to non-residents. Someone floated the idea of closing the road temporarily to evaluate costs. Each time, the board leader used the same calm language, the same practiced reassurance: nothing permanent, nothing dangerous, nothing to worry about. I spoke to him privately after one meeting. I asked what would happen during a medical emergency, a fire, a night when snow or ice made alternate routes unusable. He listened politely, straightened his tie, and told me I was catastrophizing. He said policies couldn't be driven by worst-case scenarios. He said the board had done its analysis. That answer sat wrong with me. Not because it was dismissive, but because it was vague. There was no document, no written plan, no confirmation that emergency services had been consulted, just confidence. The announcement came buried in a routine update, sandwiched between landscaping notices and parking reminders. A temporary road change, short-term, part of a cost review. Emergency access, it said, would not be affected. No explanation of how, no timeline, no details. At the next meeting, questions were brushed aside. Temporary, harmless. The board leader smiled, adjusted his tie, and reminded everyone to stay focused on the numbers. Most people accepted it. Some didn't want trouble. Others trusted authority because it was easier than imagining consequences. I sat there listening, thinking about the road, about the times it had carried flashing lights toward someone who needed help. I had the uneasy feeling you get when you recognize a risk long before anyone else feels it. The calm didn't last much longer, because once that gate went up, it became clear that temporary was just another word for until something goes wrong. The first official notice arrived on a Tuesday morning, printed on HOA letterhead, and slipped under doors like a utility bill. It announced that the access road would be temporarily restricted, beginning at the end of the week. The wording was careful, almost gentle. Restricted, not closed. Temporary, not permanent. It mentioned traffic control, cost evaluation, and community safety, all wrapped together in a way that made it sound responsible instead of reckless. What it didn't mention was how emergency vehicles were supposed to get through. At the emergency HOA meeting that followed, the room filled faster than usual. People stood along the walls, arms crossed, voices low. The board leader took his seat at the front, straightened his tie, and waited for the chatter to die down. When someone asked directly whether fire and medical access would be affected, he didn't hesitate. "Let's stay focused on the numbers," he said, smiling calmly. He talked about savings. He talked about liability. He talked about alternate routes as if they were interchangeable pieces on a map instead of steep, narrow roads that iced over first and flooded last. He said emergency services were adaptable. He said the board had done its due diligence. No one was reassured, but the confidence was effective. It always is. The barrier went up 2 days later. It wasn't subtle. A metal gate bolted into place. Concrete blocks flanking it like punctuation marks. Signs warning against unauthorized access. It looked permanent in every way that mattered. I stood there with a few neighbors, staring at it in silence, waiting for someone to say this couldn't be right. Someone finally did. A woman with a medical bracelet asked how an ambulance would get through if she collapsed. The board leader, who had come out to oversee the installation, straightened his tie and said the alternate route was sufficient. When she pressed him, his smile tightened. He said emergencies were rare and that the board couldn't justify full access for hypothetical scenarios. That was the moment I understood this wasn't going to be resolved with common sense. I tested the alternate route myself later that day. I drove it slowly, imagining it under snow, under ice, under pressure. The turns were tight. The shoulders dropped off sharply in places. There were spots where two cars could barely pass, let alone a fire engine. I took photos. I measured distances. Old habits resurfaced without me asking them to. That night, I emailed the HOA with specific questions. Was emergency services notified? Was there a written access plan? Who approved the closure? The response came back short and dismissive. The decision was approved. Emergency access would not be affected. Further inquiries were unnecessary. The next escalation came quickly. A neighbor propped the gate open with a cinder block one afternoon, saying it made him nervous to see it locked. Within hours, he received a violation notice, tampering with HOA property, fine enclosed. The message was clear: do not touch the gate. Another resident posted a warning sign near the entrance, handwritten and blunt, asking emergency responders to call residents for access if needed. The HOA removed it and issued a warning for unauthorized signage. The atmosphere changed after that. Conversations became quieter. People looked around before speaking. The board leader's confidence grew sharper, his tone less patient. At the next meeting, he opened by reminding everyone that interference with HOA operations could result in penalties. He said it politely, but it landed like a threat. I tried one more time to approach it calmly. I asked if we could at least schedule a walkthrough with emergency services to confirm access. He adjusted his tie, smiled, and said the board had already evaluated the situation. He said outside involvement would complicate matters and increase liability. That sentence stayed with me. Increase liability. It was the kind of phrase people use when they want to sound cautious, not when they want to be accountable. The first real confrontation happened in the parking lot after that meeting. A father with two young kids raised his voice, demanding to know who would be responsible if something went wrong. The board leader didn't raise his voice back. He didn't need to. He just repeated the same phrase: temporary measure, cost review, alternate access, until the words lost meaning. I watched the exchange and felt something settle into place. This wasn't about misunderstanding. It was about control. The board wasn't open to discussion because discussion implied risk, and risk threatened their authority more than any emergency ever could. That night, I started paying closer attention. I reread meeting minutes. I noticed what was missing. No mention of emergency coordination, no documentation of notification, just broad language and confident conclusions. I saved copies, I archived emails. I didn't know exactly what I was building yet, but I knew it would matter. The escalation reached a new level when the HOA sent out a community-wide email warning residents against contacting township officials. It framed such contact as spreading misinformation and creating unnecessary alarm. The message urged residents to trust the board's expertise. Trust us. Don't verify. That was the inciting moment for me, the point where concern became something else, because I recognized that tactic. I'd seen it before, dressed up in professional language, used to shut down questions instead of answering them. By the end of the week, the gate had become a symbol, not just of blocked access, but of how quickly authority can harden when it isn't challenged. People walked past it every day, some angry, some resigned, some pretending it wasn't there at all. I stood there one evening as the sun went down, watching headlights slow and turn away, rerouted by a decision that had never been properly explained. And for the first time, I felt certain of one thing: this wasn't going to end quietly. Because the road wasn't just closed, it was daring something bad to happen. The first real consequence didn't arrive with sirens and shouting. It arrived quietly, the way most disasters do, disguised as something that almost worked. It was late afternoon when Gerald's wife ran into the street, phone pressed to her ear, her voice breaking as she shouted his name. Gerald was in his 70s, polite to a fault, the kind of neighbor who returned tools cleaner than he borrowed them. He'd been complaining about chest pain earlier that day, brushing it off like men of his generation often do, until he couldn't. Someone called emergency services. Someone else brought a chair, and then we all waited for the sound we'd always trusted. The sirens came, but they didn't get closer. They drifted, then stalled, then faded as if someone had turned the volume down halfway. A police cruiser arrived first, slowing to a confused stop at the lock gate. The officer stepped out, stared at the barrier, then keyed his radio with a sharp movement that told me this wasn't normal. A minute passed, then another. The ambulance finally appeared from the back road, crawling uphill, its tires crunching over gravel. The medic jumped out, already breathing hard. His jaw set tight. He didn't say much, but he didn't have to. The look on his face said everything. Gerald survived. But later we were told the delay mattered, that a few more minutes could have changed the outcome entirely. That should have ended it. It didn't. We documented everything. Times. Wrote statements. We brought it to the HOA with calm voices and hard facts. We didn't accuse. We didn't threaten. We asked them to reopen the road before something worse happened. The board leader listened, straightened his tie, and said it was an isolated incident. At the next meeting, he framed Gerald's emergency as proof that the alternate route worked. He said responders adapted. He said the system functioned as intended. He warned against emotional reasoning. And then, without irony, he reminded us to stay focused on the numbers. That was when fear spread through the neighborhood, not loud fear, but the kind that seeps in quietly and makes people look over their shoulders before speaking. A mother down the street admitted she'd started keeping her son's inhaler by the bed instead of in the medicine cabinet. Another neighbor confessed she'd timed how long it took to drive the alternate route at night and didn't like the answer. A man with a bad knee said he slept in his clothes now, just in case. None of this made it into official complaints. These were whispered confessions, shared on porches and driveways like secrets. I tried again, this time outside the HOA. I called the township. I explained the situation carefully, sticking to facts. Locked primary access, emergency delays, no visible coordination. At first I got procedural questions. Jurisdiction, road designation, HOA authority. But when I mentioned the rerouted ambulance and the fire engine's delayed arrival during a garage fire a few nights later, the tone changed. Yes, there was a fire too. It started small, someone working late in their garage. Flames caught faster than expected. Smoke rolled over the trees before anyone realized what was happening. Neighbors grabbed extinguishers. Someone called emergency services. And again, the sirens slowed. Again, the engine had to approach from the back, struggling through tight turns and poor clearance. The firefighters did their job, but their frustration was visible. This wasn't how it was supposed to work. The HOA's response the next day was a polished statement claiming the incident demonstrated the effectiveness of the alternate route. That was the moment something inside me snapped into focus. The township official I spoke with said delays in emergency response were a serious concern. He asked questions that mattered. Had emergency services been formally notified? Was there a written access plan? Was the road historically used as primary access? I told him what I knew and what I didn't. He promised to look into it. The HOA found out I'd made that call within 48 hours. The notice arrived like a slap. Accusations of harassment, warnings about defamation, A fine for unauthorized interference creating liability exposure. The language was cold and precise, designed to scare without saying the quiet part out loud. Stop, or else. Others felt it too. Fines for trivial violations multiplied. Trash bins measured. Parking rules enforced with sudden zeal. It was pressure, applied evenly and relentlessly, meant to remind everyone who held power. Sleep became fragmented. I woke at odd hours, listening for sirens like they were an alarm clock. Every time I heard one, my stomach tightened until it passed freely down the road, or didn't. I charged my phone obsessively. I kept the scanner volume higher than it should have been. Then came the call that felt worse than the others. It was just after dark. The voice on the line was shaking. A medical emergency. Severe. An ambulance already en route. I stepped outside before the call even ended. My eyes locked on the entrance like I could will it open. The sirens came fast this time, louder. Urgent in a way that made my pulse spike. And then they slowed. Dispatch chatter spilled into the air from a neighbor's open window. Confusion. Reroute instructions. A pause that went on too long. I watched headlights stop at the barrier again, watched red and blue lights paint the metal gate like it was mocking us. People ran into the street. Someone shouted at the locked fence. Another neighbor slammed a fist into it hard enough to make the chain rattle. The contracted guard wasn't there this time. Just the gate. Silent. Absolute. I stood there, listening to the voices on the scanner strain to make the impossible work, and felt something shift from fear into resolve. This wasn't just mismanagement anymore. This was a countdown, and the worst part was knowing that next time we might not get another near miss. We might get the kind of outcome that can't be walked back, explained away, or buried in meeting minutes. As the ambulance turned away to take the long route again, I realized something with terrifying clarity. The warnings were over. Reality had arrived. And it wasn't done with us yet. I didn't run toward the gate that night the way I had before. That surprised me. Fear usually pulls you forward, makes you shout, makes you believe that if you argue hard enough, someone in charge will suddenly remember they're responsible for other human beings. But standing there, listening to dispatch voices strain over the scanner while the ambulance rerouted again, something colder settled in. Panic wasn't going to fix this. I went back inside and did what I'd been trained to do years ago, long before HOAs and locked gates ever entered my life. Back when I worked as a paralegal, my job wasn't drama or courtroom speeches. It was documentation, timelines, liability chains, proving what happened, when it happened, and who knew about it. That instinct kicked in like muscle memory. I started recording everything. Not just the emergencies themselves, but the delays. The exact moment sirens slowed, the time stamps on dispatch chatter, the route changes. The way responders hesitated because they were seeing barriers they hadn't been warned about. I filmed the gate from multiple angles, walked its length to show there was no emergency bypass, captured the cheap chain and padlock like they were evidence from a crime scene. The next morning, before the adrenaline even faded, I started building a case. I requested dispatch logs through the township, not emotionally, not accusingly, just dates, times, routing notes. I pulled response records from the fire and medical calls we'd witnessed. I printed HOA emails where they claimed emergency access was unaffected. I saved meeting minutes where the issue was never formally addressed. I lined everything up side by side and watched the truth emerge in black and white. Delays weren't rare. They were consistent. And then the phone rang. A fire captain introduced himself, his voice calm but tight, like someone who had been holding something in for too long. He said crews had been rerouted multiple times entering our neighborhood. He said the alternate route created unnecessary risk. Then he said the sentence that changed everything. They had never been formally notified. No closure notice, no access plan, no coordination. Nothing. I asked him to repeat it. He did. Slower, clearer. Because he wanted me to understand exactly how serious that was. Emergency services had been forced to improvise during active calls because an HOA decision had never been communicated through proper channels. That wasn't a misunderstanding. That was a violation. The captain offered to document it. Incident summaries, professional statements, clear language about response standards and safety impact, not opinions, facts. I thanked him and felt the first real shift in weeks. For the first time, I wasn't alone in this. I followed the thread further. Through a contact of a contact, I spoke with a risk assessor who dealt with insurance exposure for residential communities. I didn't name the HOA. I didn't dramatize anything. I just laid out the situation: a primary access road restricted, emergency vehicles delayed, no notification to responders. There was a long pause on the line. Then he said, flatly, "That's a liability nightmare." He explained it simply. If an HOA controls access and knowingly restricts emergency response, they assume responsibility for preventable harm. If emergency services aren't notified, it's worse. If insurance carriers aren't informed, coverage can be compromised. And if local safety codes require clear access, the HOA could be operating out of compliance. That was the moment I stopped thinking in terms of HOA politics. This wasn't a disagreement, it was exposure. I thought about Gerald's wife on the porch, shaking, about the firefighter's clenched jaws, about the mother who kept her son's inhaler by the bed because she didn't trust help would arrive in time. These weren't hypotheticals. These were warnings already paid for in fear, so I changed tactics. I stopped attending meetings to argue. I stopped emailing questions that would be brushed aside. I documented, I archived, I verified, I saved voicemails, I screenshot notices. I asked neighbors to write statements in their own words, date them, and sign them. I didn't tell them to exaggerate. I told them to be precise. Facts survive scrutiny. The HOA didn't notice at first. They were too busy issuing fines, reminding residents to stay focused on the numbers, and convincing themselves authority was the same thing as immunity. But I knew better now. I sat at my table late one night, evidence spread out in careful stacks, timelines aligned, recordings backed up in multiple places. I drafted 2 documents, one formal, addressed to officials who dealt in compliance and liability, the other written plainly, for anyone who needed to understand what was really happening without HOA language getting in the way. I wasn't preparing to ask the board to reconsider. I was preparing to show them what they'd done. Because once emergency access becomes a documented risk instead of a talking point, the conversation changes, and I was done pleading for safety like it was a favor. From that point on, everything I did had one purpose: to put the truth somewhere they couldn't bury it. Once the evidence started stacking up, the fear in the neighborhood changed texture. It didn't disappear, but it hardened into something steadier. People stopped asking, "What if?" and started asking, "What do you need?" I kept my process quiet and deliberate. No mass emails, no dramatic confrontations, just preparation. I set up cameras facing the entrance from 2 different angles, not hidden, not secret. Just enough to capture timestamps, vehicle positions, and the reality of the barrier during normal hours and emergencies alike. Every recording was labeled by date and time. Every file backed up twice. I built a master timeline that showed each incident in order, lined up against HOA notices and meeting minutes. When you laid it all out, the pattern was undeniable: decisions made first, consequences ignored later. Neighbors began coming to me instead of whispering to each other. One by one, they shared stories they hadn't felt safe putting in writing before. A woman whose husband had slipped on ice during a reroute delay and waited alone in the cold. A delivery driver who watched an ambulance turn around and take the long way while a crowd stood helplessly behind the gate. The mother I'd spoken to before admitted she hadn't slept through the night in weeks, listening for her son's breathing, inhaler still on the nightstand. Each story was specific, measured, real. I asked them to write it down exactly that way. No exaggeration, no anger. Signed. Dated. As those statements grew, the HOA's tone sharpened. Emails lost their polite openings. Notices arrived faster. Fines multiplied over things no one had cared about before. Trash bins measured to the inch. Parking violations issued without warning. It was retaliation. Plain and simple, dressed up as enforcement. And every notice went straight into the binder. The board leader's favorite phrase showed up again and again in his emails and meeting summaries. Let's stay focused on the numbers. It was always there, like a shield. Like repeating it enough times would make everything else irrelevant. Then the announcement came, a special HOA meeting. Mandatory attendance encouraged. Purpose: to resolve ongoing concerns regarding community access and misinformation. The wording was careful, but the message was clear. They wanted this done, finished, voted into permanence before outside pressure could take hold. They wanted to settle it on their terms. I didn't respond publicly. I didn't warn them. I just adjusted my plan. I contacted the township again, but this time I didn't sound like a worried homeowner. I spoke like someone presenting a file. I referenced specific incidents. I provided dates and response times. I mentioned that emergency services had confirmed no formal notification of closure. I asked directly whether someone from Public Works or Emergency Management could attend the meeting as an observer. The response came back quicker than before. They couldn't promise intervention, but they confirmed receipt of the materials I'd sent ahead of time. They acknowledged the seriousness of restricted emergency access. They said someone would review the situation. That was enough. I reached out to the fire captain again. He couldn't attend personally, but he offered a written statement detailing the reroutes, the delays, and the operational risks. He reminded me, calmly, that emergency response works best when access is predictable. His words were professional and devastating in their simplicity. I also spoke once more with the risk assessor. I asked one question. If this were presented publicly, what would matter most? Documentation, he said, and whether the board was warned. We had both. In the days leading up to the meeting, the neighborhood felt like it was holding its breath. Conversations were quiet, but purposeful. People didn't ask whether to show up. They asked where to sit, whether to speak, whether to stay silent. I told them the same thing every time. Don't argue. Don't interrupt. Let them commit. The night before the meeting, I organized everything one last time. Printed timelines. Highlighted contradictions, audio files queued and tested. USB drive labeled and duplicated. My bag sat by the door like I was leaving town, not walking into a room full of folding chairs and authority. I slept lightly, waking once to the distant sound of a siren passing freely down the road. It didn't slow. It didn't hesitate. It just moved through the neighborhood the way it always had before all of this started. In the morning, I felt something I hadn't felt in weeks. Not confidence, readiness. The board thought this meeting would end the problem. They thought a vote and a few confident phrases would restore order. They believed authority was enough. They didn't know what was in my bag. They didn't know how many people were done being quiet. And they didn't know that once facts are spoken out loud, you can't find them back into silence. By the time I locked my door and walked toward the community room, everything that needed to be in place was already there. The evidence was ready. The witnesses were prepared. The outside eyes were watching. All that was left was to let the people who created the problem explain it themselves, One last time, before the truth cut through the room. And this time, it wasn't going to be ignored. The community room felt smaller than it ever had, like the walls had leaned in while no one was looking. Folding chairs were packed close together, knees nearly touching, the air thick with heat and anticipation. Conversations stopped in short bursts whenever a board member walked past, then resumed in quieter tones. Everyone was here. Even people who never came to meetings were sitting rigidly in their seats, eyes fixed forward. At the front, the board leader sat perfectly upright, hands folded, tie already straightened. He looked calm in the way people do when they believe the outcome is guaranteed. The property manager hovered beside him with a laptop. Scrolling through slides like this was just another routine presentation. Nothing about the setup suggested urgency. Nothing suggested lives had been put at risk. I took a seat near the center of the room, close enough to be seen but not close enough to invite attention. My bag rested at my feet. I didn't open it. Not yet. The board leader tapped the microphone and smiled. He thanked everyone for attending. He talked about transparency. He talked about unity. Then, without pause, he pivoted into what he clearly thought would end the conversation once and for all. Charts appeared on the screen behind him: maintenance costs, snow removal expenses, insurance projections, numbers in neat columns, clean and impersonal. He straightened his tie. "Let's stay focused on the numbers," he said, voice smooth and practiced. He described the road closure as a temporary adjustment, necessary for financial sustainability. He said the board had acted responsibly. He said alternate routes had proven effective. When he mentioned emergency services, he did it quickly, like a footnote, saying responders were trained to adapt and that no serious harm had occurred. A low murmur spread through the room. A resident raised her hand and asked whether emergency services had been formally notified. The board leader nodded sympathetically, straightened his tie again, and said communication existed where appropriate. He didn't specify how. He didn't specify when. He moved on. Another resident asked why fines were being issued to people trying to keep the gate open during emergencies. The board leader sighed, as if burdened by unreasonable expectations, and explained that interference created liability risk. That safety had to be managed through policy, not an emotion. I felt my jaw tighten. I kept my hands still. The slideshow continued. A bar graph appeared labeled Response Time Variance, with vague ranges and no sources cited. He gestured toward it confidently and said the data showed no meaningful delay. He didn't say where the data came from. He didn't have to. Confidence filled the gaps. "Let's stay focused on the numbers," he repeated. People started speaking out of turn then. A father stood and demanded to know what would happen if his child stopped breathing in the middle of the night. The board leader listened patiently, then responded that policy couldn't be built around worst-case scenarios. A woman shouted that emergencies were the entire point of the road. The board leader raised his hand and asked for order, reminding everyone that emotional reactions didn't change fiscal reality. I watched the room instead of him. Faces flushed, hands clenched, people leaning forward, then sitting back again, caught between anger and fear. This was the moment the board had trained them for. Say enough authoritative words, apply enough pressure, and people second-guess their own instincts. The board leader glanced at the clock. He said the board had heard enough. He announced that the purpose of the meeting was to settle the issue and move forward. He explained that under the bylaws, the board had authority to implement temporary closures in the interest of cost control and safety. He said they would be voting to confirm the current access configuration and end what he called ongoing disruption. Not a community vote, a board vote. The property manager slid a printed motion across the table. One of the board members leaned into the microphone and began reading it aloud, voice careful and deliberate. The words sounded permanent. Final. I stayed quiet. The board leader's confidence sharpened as the motion was read. He scanned the room, already victorious, already imagining the minutes recorded and filed. This was how authority worked in his mind. Speak it into record, and it becomes reality. A board member said, "All in favor," and hands began to rise at the front table. My pulse slowed instead of racing. I could hear my own breathing. I could hear the low hum of the lights overhead. I could hear someone behind me whisper, "This can't be happening." The board leader straightened his tie one more time. That was when I felt the weight of the bag at my feet, heavy with paper and proof. I thought about Gerald's wife on her porch, about the firefighters' faces when they were forced to take the long way, about the mother who slept with an inhaler inches from her hand every night. I thought about how close we had come to accepting this because authority sounded confident. The board member reading the motion paused and looked toward the leader for confirmation. The leader nodded once, a small, satisfied movement, like sealing an envelope. I didn't raise my hand. I didn't shout. I stood. The scrape of my chair against the floor cut through the room like a crack of thunder. Conversation stopped instantly. Every head turned. Even the board leader froze, his nod unfinished, his tie still between his fingers. "I need to speak," I said. My voice didn't shake. That surprised me too. The board leader opened his mouth to object, then hesitated. There were too many witnesses. Too many phones already lifted, recording. He cleared his throat and said I could have a few minutes. I reached down and lifted my bag. The room felt suspended, like everyone understood something irreversible was about to happen, but didn't know which direction it would fall. I stepped forward, past the rows of chairs, past the line the board thought no one would cross. And as I set the bag down on the table, unzipping it slowly, deliberately, I knew the meeting was no longer under their control. For a moment, the room didn't breathe. The board leader's hand hovered near his tie like muscle memory, then dropped as I reached into the bag. I didn't rush. Rushing makes things sound emotional. I pulled out my phone, connected to the small speaker I'd tested twice before, and set it on the table where everyone could see it. The board leader opened his mouth to interrupt. I pressed play. Unit holding at primary entrance. Gate is locked. Repeat. Gate is locked. The sound cut through the room mid-sentence, sharp and intrusive, like it didn't belong there, because it didn't. The board leader's voice died in his throat. Chair shifted. Someone gasped quietly from the back. The dispatcher continued, calm but strained. Attempting alternate route. Advised delay. I let it play just long enough. Not long enough to be dismissed as noise. Long enough to be understood. Then I turned the phone face down and held up the printed logs. "These are response records," I said, keeping my voice level. "Dates, times, routes. Side by side. What should have happened versus what did." I walked them through it slowly. Gerald's call. The garage fire. The late-night medical emergency. Each one showed the same pattern, a delay that began at the locked gate. Minutes lost. Every time. The board leader leaned forward, his voice tight. He said emergency services were adaptable. He said delays were negligible. He said the board had acted responsibly. So I answered the question he'd been avoiding since the beginning. Emergency services were never notified. The room reacted like I'd dropped something heavy. I read the email from the fire department confirming no formal notice of closure had ever been received. Then I played the recorded statement from the fire captain, his voice steady and unmistakably professional, as he explained that rerouting without notification compromised response standards and placed both residents and crews at risk. When the recording ended, the silence wasn't empty anymore. It was charged. The board leader shook his head and said there must have been a misunderstanding. He said communication existed. He said procedures had been followed. I opened the binder and showed the A's own notices. Newsletters claiming emergency access was unaffected. Meeting minutes with no mention of coordination. Emails warning residents not to contact outside agencies because it would create liability. Which is it? I asked quietly. Access unaffected or access uncoordinated? He straightened his tie and tried to answer both at once. He contradicted himself mid-sentence, corrected himself, then tried again. The property manager beside him went pale, eyes fixed on the documents now spread across the table. That was when a man near the back stood and introduced himself as a township official. He said his office had reviewed the materials earlier that week. He said the primary access road had historically been treated as critical for emergency response. He said restricting it without formal coordination raised serious concerns. Another voice followed, this one measured and deliberate. A risk assessor explained the liability exposure plainly. Restricted access, documented delays, prior warnings, no notification to responders. He didn't accuse anyone. He didn't need to. He explained what insurance carriers do when preventable risk is documented. The board leader's confidence collapsed in real time. He interrupted. He deflected. He said the road wasn't officially designated. Then he said it was never fully closed. Then he said emergency vehicles could request access if needed. When asked how, he had no answer. When asked why residents were fined for trying to keep the gate open, he snapped that enforcement was necessary. A board member leaned toward him and whispered urgently. Another shifted in their seat, eyes wide. The motion that had seemed inevitable minutes earlier now sat untouched, radioactive. The township official spoke again, firmer this time. The barrier needs to be opened immediately, he said, pending full review. The word immediately landed hard. The property manager quietly said something to the board leader, who finally asked for a recess. It was denied. Another board member quickly moved to table the vote. Someone seconded it before the leader could object. The motion collapsed without ceremony. People exhaled like they'd been underwater too long. Phones came out. Messages were sent. Calls were made. Authority shifted hands without anyone raising their voice. We walked outside together into the cool night air. Headlights swept across the entrance as a service truck pulled up. Workers moved fast, cutters flashing under portable lights. The chain hit the pavement with a sharp metallic crack that echoed louder than any applause. The gate swung open, and as if on cue, sirens appeared at the far end of the road, not slowing, not hesitating, coming straight through. An ambulance passed the open entrance without breaking stride, lights flashing, engine steady. A fire engine followed, broad and unmistakable, reclaiming the space it had always been meant to occupy. People stepped back, some crying openly now, others frozen in place, watching proof roll past them. I stood there as the vehicles disappeared down the street, moving freely at last. The barrier was gone. The road was open. And for the first time since this started, emergency lights moved through our neighborhood the way they always should have. Without permission, without delay, without anyone standing in the way. The days after the gate came down felt unreal, like the neighborhood was waking up from a long, tense dream. The fallout was swift and quiet. The board leader resigned less than a week later, citing personal reasons that fooled no one. 2 other board members followed, stepping down without speeches or explanations. The property management company terminated its contract soon after, leaving behind a short, carefully worded message about alignment issues. An interim board was installed under township oversight, and their first official action was simple and unmistakable: the access road would remain fully open at all times, with emergency priority permanently protected. No reviews, no conditions, no temporary language. Seeing that promise in writing mattered more than any apology ever could. The barrier didn't just unlock, it disappeared. The concrete blocks were hauled away. The signs vanished. The road looked wider without them, like it could finally breathe again. Emergency services were formally notified that the primary route was restored, and a fire engine drove through once during the day just to confirm it in person. Watching it roll past, unimpeded and unhurried, settled something deep in my chest. Neighbors found their voices again. People stopped me on walks. Some apologized for staying quiet. Others admitted they hadn't realized how close we were to something irreversible. No one blamed anyone else. Fear had been applied carefully and consistently, and it worked until it didn't. What mattered was that it broke before the worst happened. Life eased back into its rhythm. Sirens still passed through, but now they moved cleanly down the road, without slowing, without rerouting. Each time I heard them, I felt relief instead of dread. The mother down the street told me she'd moved her son's inhaler back into the medicine cabinet. "I don't keep it by the bed anymore," she said almost shyly, like admitting she'd been scared was harder than admitting she wasn't now. That one detail stayed with me, because it meant something had changed. I thought often about how close we'd come. How easy it would have been to accept the gate as normal, to trust authority because it spoke confidently, to stay silent because speaking carried consequences. The barrier itself had been obvious. The real danger was how quickly people learned to live around it. Silence almost did the damage. I kept the binder, not as a warning but as a reminder. Not every threat announces itself loudly. Some arrive with polished language and calm smiles, asking you to focus on numbers while ignoring the cost that can't be measured on a spreadsheet. Vigilance doesn't mean living in conflict. It means paying attention when something essential is treated as optional. On quiet mornings, I sit on my porch with coffee and watch the road. Kids ride bikes across it. Delivery trucks come and go. And sometimes, without warning, red and blue lights sweep past, purposeful and unimpeded. Each time I let myself watch until they disappear, just to be sure. We didn't win because we were louder than the HOA. We won because the truth held up when it was finally put where everyone could see it, and because a neighborhood remembered that safety is not a privilege to be budgeted, but a responsibility we owe each other. If you want to hear more true stories like this, make sure you hit that subscribe button to HOA Update. And tell me in the comments, where are you watching from?